Victoria has some very, very old families and some many stories and characters. My grandfather was one. I'd like to talk a little bit about him. He was born in 1865 in England. He was schooled at the University of Bristol and in his grade schools there. He took zoology and biology. He was also, we don't have any record of it, but I've heard him speak. He spoke many languages, and even as a young man. And after he came to Canada, in about 67, he left and came on the east to the East Coast at the age of about 20. And he told me when I was little, he walked and rode horse all the way across Canada. Because there wasn't much happening in those days as far as transportation. He was very much influenced by Darwin and Wild Bill Cody. For some reason, he liked Western things. He even dressed that way at times. He came through Winnipeg to Calgary, and he didn't like Calgary, even though it was very Western. He wrote his mother that the ink froze, and he had to keep it on the stove so he could write to her. So he didn't care for it. He came to Victoria after. This is all in the period of about 2 years. And he arrived in Victoria. He walked to Shirley, which is, Shirley is an area, if you don't know, on the West Coast, and preempted Section 79, which is more or less a Hudson Bay grant. He built a little cabin there and lived for a while, and parts of it was still there a few years ago, just the boards. He then came to town in Victoria, and his first place he stopped and took was on Calumet Avenue, the corner, Calumet and Saanich Road. He wasn't very well accepted after a while because of his animals. He had quite a collection of smaller animals, and the stench would drive anybody crazy. So that the neighbors pretty well, through their dislike for him, he moved his animals and all to Cadbury Bay Road by the Willows Beach, toward the Willows. And from there he moved again to Saanich and even to Sydney, and then back to Saanich again. I'd like to read you an account by a reporter with The Colonist at the time. And it's the first, what we really, he was noticed, or people. We don't know the exact date that he arrived here, but it was all when he was a boy. This, my brother, thank God, he researched most of the family for about 20 years, and some of the things he picked up that he wrote in, filled this book. It says, it was January the 6th, 1898, that this was written by The Colonist. It says, wild beasts for pets. It says, how an Englishman of Victoria amuses himself with his menagerie. Mr. French of Cadbury Bay Road and his interesting collection of native animals. There's a menagerie near Victoria City of which populace would know practically nothing. The prior asks no admission for those to see the show. In addition, he gives an entertaining exhibition of power of man over beast, which equals similar performances in the best of regulated circuses in the land. At this time, he would be about 20 years old, by the way. About 2 miles from the business portion of the city on the Cabra Bay Road and near Willows lives a man who has made a lifetime study of animals of every kind. He has been a number year collecting his present menagerie, and he claims that in time we'll have the best, at most assorted collection of animals in the country. His sole thought, apparently, is of animals, birds, etc. In his collection, while possessed of independent means, he seldom moves out of the little world he has created for himself. He was a person who accepted everybody. He accepted them, expected them to accept him the same way. He respected their rights, and he wanted his the same. He was very, in other words, he didn't like people, but he accepted them. He was by himself quite a bit. It says, it's a member of the colonist staff visited Mr. French's home the other day and was pleasantly entertained by the young gentleman for fully an hour, during which everything around the unique abode was seen and discovered. Mr. French lives in a lonely hut situated almost opposite the Willows, and it is not difficult to find the place. As the hut is approached, after leaving a thick cluster of scrubby trees, a deafening din arises. It seems as if pandemonium is turned loose. Innumerable dogs yelp and bark, and the other wild animals on the place and their quota to add their quota to the chorus. It's because they know a stranger is visiting the place, say Mr. French in the explanation. Then, too, it's near mealtime, and the brutes are getting hungry. Mr. French is a tall, stalwart Englishman with drooping, semi-military, light golden mustache. He wore a white sombrero at the time of the colonist man's call, and the rest of his apparel was in keeping with the Wild West idea. He told me that it was the cowboys in Calgary. Actually, I think they were leading him on. He had gaudy shirts and chaps of sheepskin, which they never used, and he said he was quite a sight. After the reporter explained his mission, Mr. French led the way to 3 immense cages behind the hut, where, as he explained, some of his pets were housed. The first cage contained a large female panther, which was captured at San Juan River. Even before a close approach was made, the beast exhibited a vicious nature by rushing from end to end of the cage, showing its teeth. "I'll soon tame her," said Mr. French, and as he unlocked the barred door and boldly entered the cage. "Lie down, puss," he said, as the beast made a vicious spring, striking the opposite side of the cage with her powerful paws. Then followed a scene full of excitement in which it was hard to tell for a time whether the master or beast would triumph. The panther hadn't been fed for many hours and appeared to be wild with hunger. At every approach, Mr. French, it struck furiously at him, and for a time it seemed as if he would be torn to pieces. "Lie down, puss," he repeated again and again, and only after many efforts to approach her that he succeeded in quieting her enough to pat her on the head. After this exciting performance, a cage containing 2 large black bears was visited. They made no move when Mr. French entered the cage, and he threw them around and played with them as if they were Newfoundland dogs. The third cage contained 2 fine species of coyotes. The only time they exhibit any signs of anger, said Mr. French, is that I pretend to molest the male. And on one occasion, this had a narrow escape of being seriously bit. Oh, he had out there at the particular time, he said he had a motley collection of cats, dogs, and a large owl, 2 raccoons, and a double-jointed Amazon parrot, which definitely refused to utter a syllable, although the master said converses slightly in English. This is the type of person that he was at that particular time, and remember still he was only a young man in his 20s. After he left that particular spot, he moved on because the neighbors, again, couldn't stand the stench of his feed, because he'd fed his animals on usually just wild carcasses of horses and cows that probably were rotting anyhow. But yeah, it's funny that from there he kept moving, and like you say, he went to Sydney, didn't like it, and then went back to Saanich Road. The owner of the property was influenced by the neighbors and wouldn't sell it to him. So, and that was the government vet. Then another person who was a friend of my grandfather's, bought the property and then resold it to my grandfather. And that was in the year before, about 1897, 98. And so he was there before Saanich actually had been incorporated. I think that was in 1906. And he was there in 1901, we know that because my uncle was born at that time. And so during his stay there, the many animals he had, as we see, was lions, tigers, elephants, and he wintered circus animals. One of them was, from the pictures here, you'll see Madeleine Del Rey, which she was a lady that trained animals for Hollywood. Her name was Del Rey, which sounds like a circus name. And the little lion in the picture there is the lion called Leo he roared on the screen of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. And it was a big mane. That lion was born in Saanich Road. And that's a picture of it there with the lady. She bought it and trained it and took it to Hollywood. He had the other picture of the animal that he had there is the big lion, Rufus, who everybody was afraid of, and the one that kept getting out once in a while because he was born in captivity, and he was as plain as a house kitten. And he came from a circus, and where he was probably got too old to exhibit anymore. So my grandfather got him, and he was short on teeth, but he was, like I say, he was just a house pet. But to a person looking at him and going in there, I don't think I would trust it. I would be a little worried myself. He scared many kids that would venture into the place. He had it fenced off, but still Rufus had the run of the yard. He'd wander around. And there's many stories that my uncles told me about the children brave enough to venture in would be scared stiff of her, be an experience they'd never forget. But he had his menagerie there, he had a number of animals, quite a few as a matter of fact. He had elephants, lions, cougars, bears, wolves, monkeys, otters, minks, horses, mules, hawks, eagles, pigeons, cranes, exotic birds. There were 39 of them. My grandmother, I'll go into her family in a minute, had dogs, cats, and she raised prize rabbits and cats in that area there. On corner of Darwin, if you ever go by Darwin Avenue and Saanich Road. He owned all that property, which he eventually lost to Scott and Pedens for feed bills. He moved a lot between the property there and what he called the ranch, which was at French Beach, which is the part we sold it. He left it to us grandchildren. We sold it to the government for a park. Out there he had also a bunch of animals, but they were more domestic. Maybe he had some bears, but he brought them back in, and so they were sold to circuses. But he had the 2 cougars that he was training. He got those he had raised because he got them as just kittens. And to get them, at that time, there was bounty paid on cougars, but they had to have their eyes open. So a lot of times when a hunter would shoot the female or the mother, the cougars wouldn't have their eyes open, so they'd just destroy them. But he was able to collect them that way and then raise them after their eyes were opened. And these 2 in particular, he kept in this log cabin here that I lived in as a child, and he had got a bear hide, and he had taken it there he was also a taxidermist, and while he was preparing it down there, he had a lantern that the cougar knocked over and burnt the place down, and they got out. And he was able to get one of them by coaxing it up, and the other one got away. And eventually, the other one had to be shot too, because they didn't know people that well. And at his Saanich property, they were always accusing him of cruelty to animals and any way to get rid of them, because the lions would roar, and if anybody knows a lion, you could hear it from miles, and it scared the neighbors and their kids. Nobody would go near the property because of that. There were stories of people. Of one day he was walking up Saanich Road and stopped by 2 men who told him not to go out there. There was a 20-footer snake in the field, and he knew it was his own. After they left, they didn't know who he was, by the way. So he went into the field and took the snake, and it was only about 4 feet, and he stuffed it up in his jacket and took it back home again. And the next day, to his surprise, there'd be about 20 to 30 people out there beating the field down looking for the snake. And he never ever told them either that he had what the snake was, or he took it home. He enjoyed people coming and asking him. He'd show them the animals, but he never charged admission or anything. But he enjoyed showing his animals to people. And when he had to leave the property there, he moved to French Beach. But I'd like to get on to his life there, but his wife, my grandmother, was born in Chemainus. Her mother was born in Oregon, and her mother was born in Oregon, on the Columbia River, in a place called Marysville, which is Chehalis now. To her mother, and her name was Witop. She was a Calipulian Indian, and she couldn't speak English, but her mother and father, her father was Iroquois Indian, worked for the Hudson Bay Company, a voyager, and her mother was a Marysville Indian. When she was born in that village, she was married to a man with the Hudson Bay by the name of Brule, and he brought her back up here because they moved up when the 49th parallel was set, because the Oregon country was all Hudson Bay, governed by the Hudson Bay Company then, and when they changed the 40 up and cleared that country, a lot of people didn't like to stay there and came back to Canada, and the others stayed down and became Americans. And they were one. They came back, and her name was Mary Ann. She took that name, and up here she had altogether 17 pregnancies. The story there is they populated the Souk area. Between her daughter, and they had 44 children, 3 women. And because that was the sign of the times then, because nothing else to do, I guess, maybe. But so when she came up here, there was the family. Her first husband was passed away. He was a Vautrin. Brule passed away, and then she married a Vautrin, who again took her back down to before the Hudson Bay moved up here, where Sir James Douglas had Fort Victoria. They moved back up and moved to around the Chemainus area where my grandmother, where their daughter was born, another Mary Ann. They named her the same name. And she married a Gowdy, a John Gowdy. Now the Gowdy family, I must tell you, I'm trying to tie them all in. He was from the Orkney Islands, James Gowdy from Orkney Islands. And quite a few from the Orkneys worked for the Hudson Bay. And he was a voyager. And that's how he ended up in Kettle Falls, eastern Washington. And he married a lady there, a Catherine, with no last name except her Indian last name. And from there, he worked there, and they moved to Victoria, with the Hudson Bay Company, to Fort Victoria. She died of a broken heart, more or less. She didn't speak English, and all her friends and family were in Kettle Falls. And they had two boys. One was James, named after his father, and the other one was John. Sir James Douglas sent to Butte Inlet with a crew to look after something up there, and probably his own, and they were massacred, the Indians. There was 9 of them. And so that took care of him. And then John married Mary Ann, the daughter of Mary Ann. And they had about 8 or 9 children. One was my grandmother, Dora Jane. She was born, and how my grandfather met her was interesting because he wrote a lot of poetry, which we have a lot of. I have some here, if anybody would like to read some of it. And in one of the poems, it's when he was out at Jordan River or French Beach. He wrote of the children that were playing and came to him, and one was a brown-eyed girl. At that time, my grandmother would be about, we pretty sure it was my grandmother. She was 7 years old, and he would be 26. I guess over the period of 10 years, they got married. As their picture is there, as their wedding. She was a very attractive lady. When she was 15, she had my uncle Ivan, which was the oldest boy, and that was in 1901. She traveled. We have no record of her ever going to school, so my grandfather probably educated her, and she's written poems we have here, and could speak a few languages herself. I don't know. And at a young age, she died when she was 49 years old of appendicitis, which nowadays is nothing, but in those days it was. So the connection between the Gaudis and the Frenches was born there with Marianne, from Marianne, and then my grandmother was a Gaudi. The other Marianne was a Wittot, was her mother. My grandfather then moved back out to French Beach, and where we all lived in the one big house that they built and we lived in the log cabin while the big house was being built. He came back and sold most of his animals. And there's some of the pictures there of her horses, one of her horses there. When she was in town, a lady that I'd run into told me that nobody would talk to her because of her color, but they admired her horses. She was well known. She was the most beautiful horses in town with her buggy. And she also, another interesting thing was her and the chief Cooper's daughter, or a wife from Souk. They also became good friends, and she was an artist also. My grandfather had a lot of paintings, which is in the Provincial Museum. Some of his other writings and his journals are in there. He has a few artifacts. The animals that he eventually got rid of, at one time, somebody did, he on his travels, he picked up a bunch of monkeys, and on the way back on the boat they died, so he pickled them and brought them back. And some of them then he had stuffed. I remember one dog-faced monkey that he'd had. He had stuffed, that was right in the doorway as you walked in the shed, and it was startling because it was quite real. He did a good job with it. A great memory, although he was very much a loner. His property at Jordan River, nobody would go near. And one day my older brother and his girlfriend went to visit him, and the ages that he had last seen my brother he'd be about 11 years old. So when he was about 18, there's quite a change in a person. And when he walked up to the gate, my grandfather came out of nowhere with a shotgun and asked him, "Who are you?" And my brother told him, and his attitude changed, opened the gate and came in, and they spent the afternoon with him. He did the same, almost the same to me. I went to visit him when I was about 16, and I hadn't seen him for about 8 years. But for some reason, he just opened the door and looked straight at me and says, "You're Leonard French." And it surprised me. I had an interesting talk with him then for about 3 hours. He told me many things about living with the Indians and such on the way out. and about some of the languages he spoke and people he had met. I was fortunate enough to, amongst a lot of his books that before they got burned, a journal that he had about the animals, and that way I knew how much he had traveled. And there were zoos he wrote about in Seattle, from Seattle, all over the States, and in France, different animals. And I think that book my brother took and gave to the Sauk Museum. I don't know where it went because it disappeared. The Sauk Museum has a lot of things of my grandfather's and grandmother. My grandmother also did a lot of beadwork and such that her mother had taught to her. There's a picture there of some of the things. Some of them just fell apart on us, but the rest is all in the Sauk Museum, all these things that he also took a great interest in the native First Nations, as I have too, because of my grandmother and her. There was more, because at first the writings and a lot of people from like in Oregon, to get the Indians were given land and such, but you had to be full Indian. And because of my other Whithot had trouble getting her land, but they finally gave it to her because of the French name of Louis Marseille, which was her father, was an Iroquois. So, but she did finally get it, and some of her children were able to get their allotment of property in Oregon, and some Indian money. I have my father's cousin, Frank Hughes, was getting about $800 a month because he went down to claim it from the American government. We never did, or should have, I guess. And besides my grandfather learning a lot of the Salish and the Chinook language here, and it's in a lot of his poetry, which was he wrote under candlelight. I meant to tell you that they had 4 boys and a girl, and they're all gone now. But they all went different ways, and they all had different interests. None of them had animals like my grandfather, which disappointed him. And being our Indian heritage, it's funny, nobody paid any attention to. When we were growing up, nobody told us we had part Indian. And although we suspected something, my grandmother's color, but we never paid any attention. Growing up as little children, you don't pay any attention. And so it was years before we started to realize it and take pride in it. My own I'm proud of. I was able to 2 or 3 years ago I was invited by a very close friend of mine, Chief Tony Hunt, to carve a totem pole, and I was it's up at the government house. I spent 2.5 months with a very interesting time, and learning a lot more about the Indian culture, which I think is getting. People are starting to understand more of it. It's a little different than the white people, but it basically is the same. At the totem pole was a replica of one that had been carved and sent to England by Mungo Martin, and Tony had worked on it over 50 years ago, and over there it had blown down, and they left it, and it started to rot. Somebody had heard about it, and the Navy brought it back because it was sent over by the Navy on a Navy ship, And they brought it back, and it was out at Dockyard for some time until the governor at the time, Stephen Point, if you remember right, was Indian, and a very clever person, interesting too. He thought it'd be good to have one made like it, and he commissioned Tony to do so, a much larger pole than the one that was originally sent over. In part, it was interesting, but I enjoyed learning the culture, is that the pole, they brought the old pole over and we carved on the new one almost alongside of it. And the old one is left there now to go back to the earth. And the new one stands just across from the gateway. If anybody's ever been to the government house, notice that pole. And I'm quite proud that I was able to work on it. And there's a pictures I have there of when the pole was when we were putting it up just the day before, they had a ceremony before it went up at the old pole, where the natives the Indians did a ceremony there in their own language, and it was the chief of the Esquimalt and his wife, because that's their territory. She gave a very interesting speech, and she was small, and where she had to shout. It was more or less help each other, and it reminded me of when we were doing the pole. There was a time limit; we had to get it ready, and there was going to be a struggle. And one day, about 3 or 4 days before we were to go up, all of a sudden, I felt like Custer. There must have been 30 Indians showed up, some in dress suits and nice clothes and everything. And without saying a word, all of a sudden they were working on the pole, and it was to get it finished. And there was one chief from up island, I remember, they had to lift the pole with a crane over the top of a building, the old building that used to be a jail down below the government house, over the top onto a truck to move it up to where we had to raise it. And as the pole was going up, the guy was still painting it, how close it was. And a lot of her speech was mostly about help each other. All of a sudden, I could see what they meant. These people just all of a sudden showed up, and everybody, without saying a word, just all of a sudden showed up. And after the pole was finished, we took it up. It went up that night, and they had a celebration up there for the pole being up there. I don't speak the language, or I would be able to understand what it was about. I do remember the next day when the pole went up, there was the speeches, and I got my blanket, and we were all introduced. And as the pole went up, it was being pulled up at the end. It started to sway, and there was too many people on one side and not another. And I seen it started to sway, and I thought, after 2.5 months, I'm not going to see that pole go down. So I jumped up, and it threw me in the air until, lucky, a lot of other people came and grabbed it. I think the picture in the paper showed me hanging onto it, but I wasn't going to let it go. It was, and like I say, it was a different feeling for me, being part Indian, that a culture all of a sudden existed, and seeing something coming from the earth and being carved and made into something. It was an experience. I really enjoyed it. And so I leave you with the same: help each other. I think that's about all I have right now on this subject of my grandfather and the French family and Gowdy family, which I say most of Souk is related are the Gaudis and the Mitchells and such. I thank you. Any,
How did your grandfather support himself?
beg pardon?
How did your grandfather support himself? He didn't charge him.
Oh, I should have mentioned the other thing. Thank you. He was a remittance man. Do you know what a remittance man is? That's somebody the family pay to stay away. Yeah. But that's why he eventually lost his property, is he just didn't have, his money ran out in England.
So how was it that he learned so many languages?
Beg pardon?
You said he spoke many
Yeah.
languages, mostly native languages? Or?
He spoke some of the dialects of the native languages from the prairies, the Cree and the Sioux out there, and in Alberta, and some here. Mostly because they learned a lot of that from my grandmother and his mother-in-law, which she spoke but it was part Chinook and the Kalapuli language, which is from down there.
Combination of the English language.
Yeah. It was a jargon more than anything, and it was almost international, where everybody. It was the easy language. It was a made-up language. I was happy to go to a lot with Tony Hunt. A lot of potlatches. They're interesting. I never thought I'd ever stand for 5 hours on a wood pile watching something, but I did, and it was, and I got to dance, and it was, which is interesting. Knowing what your culture is, and be able to do it, to get into it, and I was quite happy with that.
Where he is now?
No, the house.
Yeah.
Oh, it was a story. We all got the story that it was the house that they lived in. And I remember I lived there, was brought over from England in pieces, and it was a prefabbed house. I don't know for sure. I can't say, because I know that I remember by the veranda on it. It was moved down Darwin Avenue. It's gone now because I went and looked and I couldn't see it down there. They had moved it, somebody had bought it and moved it down, because I remembered the front of it, but it has gone to different houses are built in there now.
How long did you live there?
Beg pardon?
How long did you live there?
Well, 2 or 3 years. No, I would be maybe, well, when you're a child, I was about 3, 4 years old.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you very much. That
Oh.
was very interesting. And
Like I
please
say, I'm
come
not
up
a public speaker, but I was glad to come and tell you whatever there was.
You did a great job.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.